I rise to discuss the conference report on the fiscal year 2010 budget. Unfortunately, I will not be able to support this legislation. As a member of the Senate Budget Committee since I've been in the Senate, I spoke on this budget during the committee consideration, and I also spoke on it while it was on the Senate floor. I was unable to support it in those two times, and I am disappointed to say that I will not be able to support it here either. Today marks the 100th day of the Obama administration. It is still too early to see most of the effects of the different pieces of legislation the President has signed into law, what effect that will have on America. However, we do know one thing: it sure has cost a lot. The price tag for the so-called stimulus bill was over $1 trillion if you include the interest. The cost of the omnibus appropriation bill was about $410 billion. What does this mean? It means that over these first 100 days, President Obama has spent on an average of $12 billion a day. That's a staggering rate of spending. We cannot continue to manage our nation's finances like this. The budget proposed by the Obama administration several weeks ago is no more responsible than these other bills. It spends too much, it taxes too much, and it borrows much too much. I have mentioned these numbers before, but they are worth repeating. The President's proposal will double the public-held national debt to more than $15 trillion. Annual spending would leap from $24,000 per household to $32,000. This plan would also raise taxes by $1.4 trillion over 10 years. Now, those are not my numbers. I didn't make them up. The people hired by the Democrats, the Congressional Budget Office, picked by Senator Reid and Speaker Pelosi and the two members of the one member of the Finance Committee and one member of the Ways and Means Committee, Senator Baucus and Congressman Rangel. Those are the people who picked CBO's director, and those are his numbers. This plan would also, the increase in debt is also staggering. The President's proposal would double the debt held by public in 5 years and nearly triple it in over 10. In fact, the proposal would create more debt under every previous president that ever served, from George Washington to include George W. Bush. Now, I know that today we're not voting on the Obama proposal. However, I still think it is completely reasonable to discuss it. This proposal gives us a great insight into how President Obama views government. And we see that he wants to greatly expand it. He also no longer is a member of the legislative branch. However, he is the leader of the party that controls the legislative branch. So we know he'll have influence on how legislation is written here. One of the most troubling aspects of the document before us is the inclusion in reconciliation instructions for health care and education legislation. I don't want to talk about arcane Senate procedure today. However, this is an abuse of the process. Reconciliation is supposed to be used to return money to the taxpayers and the Treasury. It makes legislation that accomplishes this much easier to pass. These instructions require a total savings of $2 billion. This is absurd because we know that health care reform and education legislation will cost much more than $2 billion. In fact, as we know from the numbers I mentioned above, the administration has spent $2 billion every 4 hours or so. This will not be any kind of significant deficit reduction. Another worrying feature of this budget is the assault on small businesses. President Obama admits that 70% of job growth will come from small businesses. So why does this budget tax them out of existence? My colleagues on the other side of the aisle claim they are only raising taxes on a handful of small businesses. But they ignore the fact that they are hurting the businesses that are responsible for 2/3 of small business jobs. Small business jobs are key to our economic recovery. But look at what the failed policies of this Congress have done for small businesses. The so-called stimulus bill that added over $1 trillion to our national debt spend less than 0.5% on small businesses. Also, after mortgaging our future on TARP bailout, 70% of the large banks have actually decreased their small business lending. So how these small businesses that have been devastated by the economy and cannot get a loan to make payroll are going to be hit with a massive tax increase? How are these small business owners going to be able to hire even one more worker? This budget is an assault on small businesses. It taxes too much, and it should be defeated. I would like to mention energy policy before I conclude my remarks. Throughout this year's budget debate, we have talked a lot about energy, particularly a proposed cap and trade tax proposal. At a time when our nation's energy needs are continuing to grow, we should turn our focus on how best to meet those needs while creating jobs instead of taxing American families. If we act too rapidly by imposing carbon taxes on all Americans through the cost that will dramatic increase in our utility prices. If enacted, a cap and trade revenue program would institute one of the largest tax increases in American history. Every American will pay a sales tax whenever they turn the light switch on or start their car. This tax will be untargeted and regressive. Even our poorest citizens will be hit by this tax. This is a dangerous policy, and I am startled by how much support it has received from this current administration. So much for the president's promise not to tax anyone making less than $250,000 per year. Maybe that is because he knows he needs more money than he can raise by taxing just the rich to pay for all of his plans to make government even a bigger part of ordinary Americans' lives. As I have outlined above, this budget has some problems. It spends too much, it taxes too much, and it borrows too much. I urge my colleagues to join me in support of fiscal responsibility by voting against this piece of legislation.